Hello, welcome to our joint workshop between the City Council and the Planning Board. We have a number of agenda items here. I think what is most appropriate is to have staff, Director Heidegger and Planner Norton, kick off each agenda item, and then we can go from there.
All right. Thank you, Mayor. Just quickly, for the benefit of everybody, I think you folks know Shelley Norton, but we also have the land use planner here with us tonight, Craig Tebow. So you got everybody who's involved in the planning side of the shop here. Your agenda lists a number of things. With respect to items number 1 and 2, we're going to kind of group those into one discussion, and everybody should have a handout on their desk. 2 actually, one with a bunch of circles on it and one that has basically 3 things listed on it: homeless shelter, lodging houses, and community living arrangements. And we were feeling that really 1 and 2 somewhat overlap in discussion, but we're going to try to focus our discussion going through this sheet here and try to keep everyone on task, because there's a lot to discuss tonight, and if we don't get through it all, we can always have another discussion. So we wanted to start this off with homeless shelter and transitional housing, and discuss whether or not we want to regulate transitional housing. This sounds like a familiar conversation, probably. So you know what the planning board's recommendation was, you know what the housing committee's recommendation was. Quite frankly, staff is looking for guidance from these 2 groups right now as to, do we have a definition? What's that definition going to consist of? And if we are going to have a definition, and then great, where are the zones that we're going to regulate that? And that's part of another exercise tonight. When we get through these 3 items on here, then the thought is we're going to break into 3 groups, and we have maps in each of the meeting rooms here, and we'll break into 3 groups and try to get some idea from both of these groups as to where we should be regulating these types of uses, not just homeless shelters and transitional housing, but lodging houses and community living arrangements, recovery houses, group homes, if there's even a desire to do that. So the first discussion really is, what do we want to do with transitional housing? You know, are we going to regulate this? Is this something we want to regulate? We're looking for guidance from you folks, so we can potentially come back with some type of definition if one is desired. Feel free to jump in.
Anything else?
Not this time.
Okay, Councilor Harriman.
Thank you. So I think it might be helpful if we start with, whoever proposed regulating transitional housing in this way, if we could sort of define what is the end goal here and what we're trying to accomplish, and then that might help guide where we're going with it. It seemed like I don't know if it was really stated, but it seemed like before the goal was to regulate in some way the transitional housing that was proposed for the Ramada project. So I'm just wondering, but then I see, all these other types of housing come up, like group homes and community living arrangements. So it would be helpful to me, at least, if someone could articulate what the end goal is of this discussion, and then that might be helpful as to how we're gonna get there.
Councilor LaChapelle.
Thank you. Yes, Councilor Harriman, since I was one of them that was the driving force behind it, I have no problem with talking about it. Very similar to our homeless shelter ordinance, we had no ordinance on the homeless shelter. We have no ordinance on transitional housing. I think it's time that we form an ordinance. Maybe it was rushed a little bit, it was rushed through, not a problem. I have no problem. That's why we talked about possibly a moratorium, so we could do it properly and vet and get all the definitions down the way they should be. I think we need to take some time and think it through and answer all those questions. And it's very similar to the homeless shelter ordinance, that we have a transitional housing ordinance, and just to address the unknowns. We have like 6 other questions. At the last council meeting, we pulled out Recovery houses, thank you, Counselor. We pulled out recovery houses. And is there need to, there are so many definitions, we have to clarify what the definitions are. So the end result is to have some kind of ordinance on the books. How that looks, I don't know at this point, because we have nothing. I think we need to start the discussion and start moving forward on it instead of just not doing anything. So my thought, the end result, is to have an ordinance in regards to that. Thank you.
Member Cox?
If I can add a clarifying question, that is not intended to sound cheeky, truthfully. It's really helpful to hear, because when it comes to the planning board, we don't get the impetus behind it. We get the follow-through and structure of what that looks like. So that's a really helpful conversation and question and answer. As you offered a similarity between the impetus for the homeless shelter and definition and district, and the transitional housing definition, and what could very well be either included or a separate overlay or district, I guess I have a question that is, in both cases, and as this document with bubbles helps us reflect, we had homeless shelters before we created a definition and an overlay district. Likewise, we currently have what could be qualified in an undefined version as transitional housing. And the reason I say that is because it feels like in both scenarios, the scale of a project being proposed that speaks to both is part of what was the impetus for policy decisions, definitions and policy decisions. And I name that with no value judgment, but if that is the case, if the scale of the homeless shelter being proposed said this is something that we need to monitor, the scale of transitional housing, right, 120 beds, 50 beds, whereas most of our beds in these other scenarios are 4 beds or 12 beds, or that if we can be transparent about that, then it can help us define, and we heard this a little bit earlier, that if the concern is around, and we've seen this in other similarly related policy uses and regulated uses, is if the concern is around density, if the concern is around the scale of the impact, right? There's a number of cases, whether it's a recovery home or domestic violence shelter, a small scale shelter, where there isn't a concern for addressing a 4-bed or an 8-bed shelter or transitional home, or a 12-unit apartment house that might have 1 or 2 transitional residents with transitional vouchers in it. That doesn't appear to be the impetus of our concern. And so if that is the case, naming that up front will help us get to a definition that addresses scale in a way that can actually monitor and address the concerns behind it, and help us think about the scale that would be limited in the actual physical act of creating an overlay district. Because some of our current land use patterns would never allow, literally the scale of the buildings in those land use patterns wouldn't allow for a facility that could accommodate 100 beds, for example. And so if our definition was around the size of the number of beds, whether it's in homeless, transitional, or both, it might be a conversation point that could help us narrow to a definition around agreement.
Councilor LaChapelle?
Thank you. Excellent question.
Yeah.
I don't know, because we have nothing on the books.
Yeah.
So this is the opportunity for us to put that down, is maybe in the conversation, one bedroom someplace else doesn't fall into this category. We don't have anything on the books about putting nuclear power plants in our city either. And it's just addressing some of the issues. Once an issue rises up and we realize we have nothing down, maybe we should start addressing it and start looking at it. So just bringing it to the table, I think this is a discussion that we should move forward on. There's no application out there right now for anything. This is a perfect time for us to address the issue as a group. Yeah. Bringing the planning board in, that's been our talk since all year, was for us to be on the same page and have that roundtable discussion and both work on it and come back together and pound out some wording. Thank you.
Councilor Clement?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. To the point that has been raised by Councilor LaChapelle and Member Cox, this goes back further than the Ramada situation, goes back to the Park Street situation, I think. That did not come to fruition, and there was a conversation before this council wherein a certain individual representing Lewiston Housing Authority denied having any designs on Ramada for anything. And when it became known that after he told us there was no such thing, he had already signed a purchase and sale agreement 4 days prior to, he said, I was not lying to you, I was being purposefully opaque. Okay? And then we questioned, well, you're trying to put in a shelter. Oh, no, it's not a shelter, it's transitional housing. So we start playing these word games. That's when we decided we have to have this conversation. You know, we don't want to become like some other places in the state of Maine. We don't want to encourage the same types of problems that they're experiencing. We're trying to do right as stewards of the taxpayers' money. Lord knows we don't have an awful lot of that to go around in this city. So therefore, we want to be very careful. And that's why I think we're here. There are those that think that we can throw money endlessly at these problems and they're going to go away. I don't happen to be one of them. I do think we need this conversation. I think both sides need to understand where we're coming from. It seems like we come up with something, it goes, and you're hearing something different than what we thought we said. And that's where a problem lies. Transparency is not there between the two bodies. It needs to be, and we're all on the same team. We all represent the city of Lewiston. We should all be doing what is best for the city of Lewiston and the people that reside therein. That's why we're here, in my estimation. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councilor Jelinas.
Thank you. I would agree with Councilor LaChapelle in that, more conversation is warranted. I don't think that it requires a moratorium, but I think it definitely requires some time put aside. I mean, this question about whether or not we can come together on the 26th of September, I think it would make good sense for us to really come together and have more discussion. In reference to Councilor Clement and the comments that were made, I mean, it is unfortunate that transpired, but to be able to package that, put it aside and move forward, and then be able to really have some healthy discussion as it pertains to homeless shelters, as it pertains to transitional housing, that's the direction I think we should be heading in.
Councilor McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My support for adding the terminology transitional housing to the homeless shelter was because you're dealing with very similar clientele. It's homeless or near homeless individuals, and so that's why I first supported it. My support was based on, like I had said earlier, going through the homeless shelter and the homeless shelter ordinance and Xing out what shouldn't apply. Further thought on it is I think we need a totally different ordinance to deal with it, because there's too many limitations and too many expectations for a shelter, where transitional housing is a step up. To me, transitional housing is better than shelter housing, because it's a more firm footing. It's a home. It may not be much of a home, but it's a home to these individuals. But we're still talking about the same types of clientele, and they have similar problems and will need deal with similar situations. So I feel really strongly that we need to define transitional housing and then take the homeless shelter and X out everything that doesn't apply, modify it to make it work, and then turn it into its own transitional housing ordinance. I too was upset with how word games were played when it came to what was happening with the Ramada Inn. Because first it went, no, it's not a shelter, it's transitional housing, and then when it went before the appeals board, it was, no, it's not transitional housing, it's just regular housing. So that shows right there that we need to define it and then look at how we need to regulate it and put a separate ordinance into place. Thank you.
Councilor Scott.
Thank you. So I wouldn't disagree that there was some concerns around the shelter that was proposed for Park Street. But I would also like to put it aside that I'm not sure a reactionary response to transitional housing for something that was many councilors felt uncomfortable about is a necessary step to take in moving forward. I don't disagree with having a conversation. I'm willing to have the conversation and look at things. But I don't want this to be a reactionary response when we already have, as we said, we've no definition of transitional housing. We know that we have several residential care facilities. We know that transitional housing can determine and be determined to lay under many different hats. And to add more language, to add more regulation, to have a conversation around an overlay area, or if there should be licensing around that. Personally, I do not want to add more to make it harder for any kind of housing in Lewiston when we know that we are in serious need of housing in Lewiston. And I see this as possibly making it more difficult, and possibly making it more difficult for some of the existing what may be determined as transitional housing that already exist here in Lewiston. So I would just be cautious that we don't add too much to our plate here and make it more involved than it may actually have to be, because I feel that a lot of this is in response to something that happened, and we maybe shouldn't be working in that direction or in that way. Thank you.
Member Pine.
So, one of the things that came up for us as the planning board when we were discussing this at our previous meeting was that we didn't actually have a sense of the operational sort of units that would fit under the, a proposed definition of transitional housing. One of our members brought up that, if you're a landlord and you get a voucher for one apartment in your building to provide housing for someone in that, looking at this definition, that could be considered transitional housing. So we don't actually have a sense, it seems like, there's no registry of something that we haven't regulated before, right? And I think, when I think about codes and regulations, we're doing that in response to, behavior that we don't want in a community, or uses that are going to impact, other members in that same area. That's what we're thinking about when we think about land use, right? And so I'm wondering with this, as it's been brought up, that we're sort of dealing with a blank slate here, and we're dealing with a situation where we don't have, I don't know if we have, at least from what the planning board's looked at, a good sense of, issues pertaining from the operation of facilities like this, in terms of community impact. It's hard to think about how you regulate something that we don't really understand its impact on communities. I'm sort of dancing around here, trying to get the words to come out right. But I think, again, since we're dealing with a blank slate, we're not reacting necessarily to a specific situation where something's gone out of hand or has become, untenable for residents. We're not regulating something that is a problem. We're trying to think of what a problem could be hypothetically based on other uses that might have some similarity, but still are different because, we have a different definition here, right? They're separate things. They have different names. So just thinking about, how do we want to proceed if we do want to define transitional housing? How do we do that in a way that is going to be, based sort of in the facts of how a facility or an operation like that will actually impact a community? And if there is no impact, piggybacking on what Councilor Scott said, do we need to regulate it if it isn't going to have that adverse impact on a community? So those are things I want to explore in this process, and I just wanted to name those.
Director Hediger, Planner Norton, did either of you have something to add at this point?
Well, again, I'm not sure it's terribly clear that there's any consensus, right, as far as whether or not we should be regulating transitional housing or not. It might be helpful if we came back with a definition. I mean, you folks have seen the definition now, right? That was based upon the code.
Can you speak into the mic? Thank you.
Based upon the Code of Federal Regulations. So you've seen the definition from that. You've also seen a slightly different definition with the proposed moratorium that you folks had last week. Is it going to be easier for you folks to react to something if you have some type of language in front of you? Because, at this point, I mean, typically we take a straw poll vote of some sort, and I don't know, and maybe there's going to be, maybe that's what we should be doing. I'm kind of looking at administration to see if that's a wise idea or not. But again, our whole goal here is we'll do whatever this group wants us to go for in a direction. We can come back with language or not. We just need to know whether or not that's something you folks really want us to pursue or not.
Member Cox?
It's been really helpful to hear some of the context that the city council members have offered for us tonight. I would say from my own perspective, to contribute to a straw poll and to offer one small slice. Given this conversation, and I think the importance of recognizing where there's claims that wordplay has been actively engaged, and that there is questions around language that has already been brought forward and has been utilized at multiple times. I believe we should create a definition of transitional housing. It should be a standalone definition from our homelessness housing. I would be supportive of that. I would also say very clearly, with my own perspective, but based on this conversation, I believe that scale. I think that I would want to see a definition and/or the ordinance address the size of this. And just to offer a little input, and maybe it's useful for others or not, but when I think of the temporary nature by definition in our current homelessness definition of homeless housing shelters, it's not meant to be permanent. And the fact that it is at a large scale, right, that it could be at 30 beds or 100 beds for a homeless shelter, is a scale that allows services for a crisis and urgent moment in a temporary nature, and that makes good sense to me. If transitional housing is intended to support individuals to move to stability and provide 24 months of stability on their longer term pathway to long-term stability, I do struggle to think about that being successful at a scale of 100 beds or even at 80 beds. And I also think that some of the conversation our planning board had around the opportunity for our private sector landlords, who are businesses, to continue to support one unit, 2 units of their 6, 8, 10, 12 unit buildings to take transitional vouchers should be addressed. And so I would love to see something that addresses in the definition transitional housing consists of beds beyond, and you've provided us with language that looks like things below 6 beds is of a different scale than things above 6 beds, and so that might be useful to think about in terms of units, and that there is a cap to the number of transitional housing beds, because I think part of what I've heard for CARE is around the potential impact for neighborhoods, and we frankly have not had that concern for the many number of types of transitional, without using a federal definition or a funding definition, the many types of transitional housing that are in our neighborhoods already across the city, where it could be one person, it could be multiple units, and the reason in which their transitional housing might come from anything from domestic violence to recovery to down on their luck and homelessness. And so I hesitate for us to step in and govern or rule make around a smaller scale and around community integration. I think the concerns that I've heard really are the impact when the scale gets to a point that we're creating a density in neighborhoods. And that's where it feels like mapping and governing would feel much more important. And so that is what I can offer you and staff in terms of some direction of, yes, there should be a definition, yes, it should be a second one. And for it to feel successful for me, it should address scale on both a min and a max.
Director Hediger, Planner Norton, are we aware of, I was trying to find it in the packet, I found the matrix for food trucks, but are we aware of other municipalities that are regulating transitional housing?
And defining it?
or defining it?
We have begun some research looking at Augusta, Bangor, Portland, and South Portland, and we've spoken with staff in South Portland, but we don't have anything to present this evening on that. We could certainly provide that at a future workshop.
We can tell
Well,
you
do
that.
they,
We can tell you with respect to South Portland, that they do not define transitional housing.
Although they plan to soon.
Yeah, they recognize they have some deficiencies with the ordinance that they've adopted.
right, I mean, my position on this hasn't changed. You know, I'm struggling to understand why we need to regulate transitional housing. You know, last week I visited Veterans Inc., which is on Main Street, and transitional housing is extremely different from a shelter. And they're doing a great job there, and the last thing they need from us is more rules and regulations or burdensome reporting. So, yeah, I just really struggling to see how we're going to be, you know, adding value to the city. I really think that we're just, you know, we're just going to make it more difficult for there to be, you know, housing in this city, which is, you know, kind of the opposite of what we need right now. Councilor LaChapelle?
Thank you. I respectfully disagree with just about everything you said on that. I guess I feel that we have a majority of the council that wants to move forward on some kind of definition, not exactly what. We did not have definitions for medical marijuana. We did not have definitions, I think Member Pine brought it up, or Member Nagin brought it up. We didn't have definitions for regular people buying marijuana, but recreational, that's what I'm trying to say, thank you. Never mind. But I think it wasn't a knee-jerk reaction. We said, oh, this is coming, we have to address it. This is no way to say that it's bad. It's no way to say that we want to close them down. It's just something we have to formulate something. And whether it is one unit that we don't address, that's all stuff that we should be talking about. And maybe for a direction, because we're not going to get this tonight, because I'm looking around the table, if each of us have a different idea, it's not going to work. Maybe that staff formulates some kind of I would say questionnaire or something like that, just to send out to get a feel of what both bodies are looking at, and just get some kind of a framework that we can start. You know, do you feel that we should be regulating units from 1 to 3 or 1 to 6, 6 to 12, or whatever? And just that's like one of the questions. What is the definition of that? And just start working that down with a bunch of, and going right down the list of the homeless shelter thing, and saying, should it be regulated? What is your thought on regulation? I have no problem. No, I'm not looking to shut down the veterans shelter. I think we should. I brought up the question. We have, and Director Hediger informed me, we have an enormous amount of single-family homes that are being purchased in the city of Lewiston that are, I call it a commercial operation in a residential area, that they're taking care of people that are there, and this is happening all across the country. Somebody's buying it, they're paying somebody to watch 3 or 4 people on the staff. My question is, shouldn't we know about this? Should the police department know about it? Should the fire department know about it? Should we have some kind of a list? This is just a question. I'm not saying that we should. I'm just saying we're seeing it pop up. I am seeing it pop up all over the place. And I just question. I know we have nothing on. I think we can move forward, send a questionnaire out, and staff tabulate it, and then come back, and that gives us at least some framework of where to start. That's my feeling. Thank you.
Member Nagin?
Just really quickly, as I read through the packet, you know, do we start with not having a definition of someone who's homeless? We have a definition for a homeless shelter, but we don't have a definition for somebody who's homeless. So when I read through the federal guidelines on definition for homelessness, I mean, if we're looking to apply definitions, we could certainly accept the federal definition and just add a line that says that if you're in transitional housing, for the purposes of the definition, you're technically not homeless per our ordinances. I think that would be one place to start.
If you want to go by they're technically not homeless. one would say they are homeless by the federal definition.
Thank you, Councilor LaChapelle.
And another piece with this is that any of the single-family homes, any of the 8 and under occupancy, they're actually licensed by the state, and the way that I've read through this packet, it suggests that you can't really restrict them from a municipal position because it's a violation of the Disabilities Act. So I think coming back to Board Member Cox's point, it may be just a scale issue. And then when we look at housing like Harbor Village, for instance, in many cases, many of the people that are there on a transitional basis. And so that's a built community for folks who specifically, we see a lot of folks that come in from refugee services into that community. And I think that is sometimes qualifies as transitional housing as well. So I think it's just, I have no problem defining transitional housing. I just think we should be careful about what the state already regulates, is all I'm saying.
Member Smith.
Thank you. I just wanted to recap what I think I've heard throughout this discussion so far. I think the first thing I heard is we're all in agreement that it shouldn't be included in the shelter ordinance. I think we all agree it needs to be defined. I definitely agree that scale should be a factor, and I would do number of units, not number of beds. Yeah. And then I love that you brought up a list, because maybe we start with asking landlords to register, to include that in the rental registry, that the annual report that they do, to say whether any of their units are being used for transitional housing. And if we're going to do some sort of a survey, surveys are always great, start with the landlord email list that we have right now to gather the onesie-twosies so that we understand that scale. And then once we have a handle on that, then we can decide whether it needs regulation. Thanks.
Member Pine.
Yeah, just to piggyback on Member Smith here. That's another way that we've developed code. We look at, what the current conditions are, what the facilities that are operating right now look like, and we sort of build code to include those, and that's the definition. We want more of what we have, right? That's often how we take an approach to zoning, we in general, in terms of, looking at planning. So yeah, that seems like a really good place to start as well, getting a sense of what we have right now and using that to size and scale things.
Councilor Pease.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Like Councilman LaChapelle said, there's a lot of companies that are buying these single-family homes and converting them into care facilities of some type. I know the one next door to me, it was not a single-family home. It was a two-family home. But somehow they got a way around it, and they're considering it a single-family home. But my question here is, these companies word things a certain way that fits them. And we need to be able to have a handle on it. Like they got support, down support solutions and up support solutions for the same building, the same house. And that's how they get away with it. There's a different organization that's utilizing a single family, but it's a two-family. So this is just one of those things that we have to keep an eye on. I'm not saying we have to go back and regulate all of these. I'm just saying if we don't do something and dot the i's, cross the t's now, we'll have no control over it later. And it'll be all hindsight. Thank you.
Director Hediger, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I am trying to be conscious of time tonight because we got a lot to talk about. And I want to make sure that, I don't stymie a good discussion. But we're not going to reach consensus tonight on transitional housing. So, Shelley and I have been talking, and we're thinking that we come back with something for you guys to look at, just some language here, taking into consideration the comments that we have heard at this point. Because part of the exercise tonight was to do a mapping exercise, right? We can't do the mapping on transitional if we don't have a good handle on what transitional housing is at that point. So we're going to save a little time, maybe getting rid of that. But I'm looking to you, Mr. Mayor. But from my perspective, I think I would like to move along and come back to you folks potentially on the 26th to have more discussion about that, knowing that it's warranted.
Perhaps, Director Hediger, but I will caution you that I have made no dinner reservations, so yes. Is there, I guess I'm prepared to move on, but is there anything else? We don't often meet together, so if you want to say something, like now is the time. So is there anything
Well, I'm not ending the conversation just on transitional housing.
No, I understand. Thank you. But would anyone else like to chime in on item number 1 here before we move forward? Councilor Scott. Councilor Harriman.
Thank you. As Member Smith said, I feel like we do need to get some kind of a handle on what we have for these types of facilities before we start, start regulating them. We could come up with a definition, and I understand the idea of being proactive before issues come up. But if we don't know, like as our packet says, staff is uncertain of the number of transitional housing residences. If we don't know what we have, then it's hard to anticipate what problems will come up. So I just think we need to get a little more information before we decide what sort of regulations we wanted to put in place.
Member Cox.
It's a bit of a clarifying question, so I appreciate that. Thank you. I think one of the things that I'm hearing, Councilor Harriman, is that we can't figure out what the regulations are unless we know what the definitions are, and you and Member Smith are raising a question of how does what we know about what's currently operating and working well in our city line up to, and part of where I hear that going is actually regulations. And I offer that because I would propose that we do hear from staff a proposed definition, which would allow us to consider and give time parallel to that to adopt the data points. Once we have an agreed upon definition, it's kind of necessary to figure out then how we use that definition in the regulations, at which point that data is vital before completing the regulatory piece. And so it's not an if then, it's a both and in my perspective in terms of timing and sequencing.
Thank you. Further comments or questions? Member Smith, thank you.
Procedural question. If we all agree that transitional housing...
Do you mind using the mic?
So sorry. Yep. If we all agree that transitional housing should not be included in the shelter, can we decide that tonight?
No, we're in a workshop.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when would that be taken up again?
It's in table.
We've tabled that, I think, at the last meeting, so,
Not anytime soon.
yeah.
It was tabled, not date specific, so it gave us the freedom to explore this path.
Okay, thank you.
We're good for now, is what I'm saying. All right, Director Hediger, what agenda item are we on now?
I think we're still on 1, unfortunately. But this workshop, originally, months ago, one of the items we were going to talk about is shelters and whether or not we should be expanding the overlay district to other parts of the community. So we have a definition of shelters. We know where shelters are allowed. And at the end of this, time permitting, that's going to be part of the mapping exercise. We were going to potentially map out where we think transitional housing would be appropriate. We don't know what transitional housing is necessarily. We don't know where it wants to go, but we do know what shelters are, and we know where they currently exist and where they are currently allowed. So that's the last comment I have really for section 1 there is we will go back to mapping tonight ideally and talk about whether or not we want to expand those areas. Because it does sound like there is consensus in that transitional is not a shelter. So if there's some agreement there that there needs to be, whether or not transitional should be a use that's regulated, we agree that it's not a homeless shelter, it's something different, great. And let's talk about shelters in the community and where we should be allowing them beyond where we are today, if that's even something that we should be allowing.
Are you saying that we're going to be discussing that next or later?
Later, it's under number one as far as, I just wanted to wrap that up as far as the overlay, where those are new areas and where we should be including them.
The intent is that we would break into 3 groups and look at the existing overlay boundaries, and in our groups discuss whether to increase, change those boundary areas. So it would be a mapping exercise. If people want to have discussion as a group on that, I mean, I suppose that could happen.
We'd be looking at the same map with 3 different groups, am I hearing that correct?
Yes, yeah.
I mean, I think,
And then we would be reporting back to you, not necessarily tonight, but we would come back to you and say, hey, out of the 3 groups, nobody thinks it should expand, or we should be expanding into this area, expanding into that area. But our intent is to try to get some input from those groups and then come back to you folks with whether or not those areas should be expanded or not.
And that's specifically on shelters?
Correct.
Okay.
I was going to say, if we're looking all at the same map with these 3 different groups, I think a group discussion on shelter overlay would be appropriate.
It's certainly up to you.
Councilor Clement, did you have something?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, I don't think it's wise that we try that until we know what we're dealing with totally. Let's get the definitional thing under control, look at the entire picture. We may find, I just think we're jumping ahead by doing something on the overlay district currently.
We're, just for clarification, we're talking about shelter overlays, not transitional overlays.
Correct.
You're suggesting that we don't even talk about shelter overlays this evening?
That's correct.
Okay. Councilor Herman.
Thank you. I guess I thought the shelter overlay discussion was item number 2, and I thought that was proposed quite a while ago as a separate item to look at to see if we should allow homeless shelters in other areas. So I do understand that there's a connection if you wanted to define transitional housing as a homeless shelter, but it sounds like that doesn't seem like a good idea. So I thought that was a separate agenda item to look at that and see if there should be other places where we should allow homeless shelters.
Councilor Scott.
Thank you. Director Hediger, are we referring to the map in number 2 of our packet that showed this overlay piece here, or is it different?
Different.
This wasn't additional stuff?
That was included in your package just to show what currently exists right now with respect to setbacks, buffers, and whatnot. The map that you see like on this table right here is going to be part of the exercise where we would sit down and figure out should we be expanding districts or not.
So I guess I would ask a specific question, and I'm not sure who might be able to answer this, whether it's you or the administration, or if somebody were to approach us in the next couple of weeks before we make any decisions on this overlay, and they have a proposal for a warming shelter, which we currently don't have anything in, but we do have winter coming, would that hinder this with not having a decision made on extending possibly the overlay and giving more possibilities for that?
I would offer that you do have an overlay district. People can always
Just go for
appeal
that.
to do a contract.
Okay,
So that is always an option to anybody.
yeah.
And, you know, the planning board and the council has considered those options in the past as well. And it would be no different from a warming shelter.
Okay, thank you.
And I guess, well, before I chime in, did you have something, Member Cox?
Just that I think the map included in our packet might be misnamed in the legend, that this is the proposed, and that in reality, this is the adopted homeless shelter overlay district, and that there is not yet a proposal for a second one, and that is what you're seeking input for.
Correct.
And so that, for anyone looking at the public packet, that map is the homeless shelter overlay district that is currently approved and can be used by those who are requesting shelters. Yep.
We're looking at the final version, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I just think it's a legend error, and I'm just double checking that that's correct. Okay.
Yes, that's correct.
Thanks.
You know, and I understand that we should wait on talking about an overlay for transitional housing since we're working on defining it and coming up with language. But I see no reason why we just can't, discuss as two bodies the shelter overlay right now. Questions on the shelter overlay? Or comments? Member Cox.
Happy to be called on last as well. I would just say from the planning board perspective and in my experience on the planning board, we did desire to see a second overlay district or an expanded area in the overlay district from the original conversations of approving this. And at a couple of different planning board meetings after this was a final overlay district and named and approved, have also then recommended this conversation. And for what that is worth in the goal of moving that conversation, some of the comments that I contributed in those planning board meetings were that the desire to see shelters be in places that support access to services and are that we're not placing a large shelter in a predominantly single-family home like NCA, NBA neighborhoods. And specifically, we contributed, and I know that we would do this in the mapping exercise, but that we wanted to look where scale and size of uses, so looking at kind of outer Westminster Street as a good example, that is served by public bus systems, that's within a mile of the downtown and is not a heavily residential neighborhood, seemed like an obvious starting point for either creating a second district or expanding the boundaries of the current district. But we recognize that that we do have a population of unhoused individuals that don't fit well into our current shelter systems and structures and available beds, that there is a need, and that if this current, realistically, the density and neighborhood makeup within our current zone really limits the opportunity and places them squarely within school districts, pretty closely to school districts, elementary school districts. And that Riverside neighborhood is largely, many properties over there are single-family homes. And so that it really kind of shoehorns any future proposals to meet a need that we are aware of, though we might not have consensus on how to address that need, right, our current need, that this doesn't provide a lot of opportunity, and that by not providing more opportunity in a clear expanded zone, then we are likely to see contract rezones in places that might not have our guidance as to where we would like to see shelters created. And so that was some of the conversation that we had, both around the why and the where of seeing additional opportunities made available.
Councilor Harriman.
Thank you. So my concern with this current overlay is that for one, it's very small. Once you put in the buffers from childcare and schools, it limits it even further. And also with the shelter ordinance that we have, this area is mostly built out already. And our shelter ordinance requires any new shelter to meet several requirements that are tough to meet in existing buildings, like the ADA accessibility. That's the big one that I can think of. So it makes sense to me, and I was disappointed that this was shrunk so much from what was originally recommended. It makes sense to me to include at least some part of the city where you could build something, because there's basically no vacant land here. There isn't really a feasible way to put in a shelter that fits all of the requirements in the shelter ordinance and meets this overlay. There are very few places where it could go, and then you're also limited by the other setbacks there. So I would support expanding it somewhere where you could actually build something and develop a shelter.
Administrator Hunter, if I recall, all shelters need to be approved by City Council, correct? And
All new shelters.
all new shelters. So, with that, knowing that, this kind of shelter lay is really kind of redundant because any location needs to be approved by the City Council. And Member Cox just mentioned, contract rezones and yeah, I mean, if the council already needs to approve the location and the details of the shelter, we don't need like another hoop. There's already some oversight there by city staff and the council. Councilor McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I disagree with that because having an overlay gives them an idea of where they can build before they even think about building. So to put a plan together and get it before the city council to get a thumbs up or thumbs down, they could be spinning their wheels because the area wouldn't be, the council wouldn't want us, I know I wouldn't want to shelter at 36 Regine Avenue. So you don't put a shelter in the middle of a single-family residential neighborhood. So I don't know if I agree with as expanding as much as Member Cox wants to. I think it needs to be kept within walking distance of the services that they need. I don't think that requiring bus travel to get to the basic services would make sense. So there may be some areas that you could grow this zone some, but I still think you need a zone that someone that wants to do a shelter can look at and say, okay, step one, it falls within the shelter overlay. Okay, now what's step two? So I think it's important to keep that. There may be some areas we can push to expand it somewhat, but I think it's important to keep it. Thank you.
Member Najin.
I would just like to point out that not all folks who require shelter services are a threat to the public, basically, or to single-family homes. And so in this space, I'm thinking specifically community members we don't serve already. So when you're talking about families, when you're talking about groups that could easily fit into a single-family neighborhood, it's more of a housing first approach where you don't concentrate density and needs, disparate needs, and you create connections to communities. So in that space, I also think that the overlay just creates a limiting effect, but that's just my opinion.
Councilor LaChapelle.
Thank you. Thankfully, Mr. Nagin, in a few more months, you'll have that opportunity to have a bigger impact on it. I'm disappointed that we are not going to get to a consensus on 1, 2, or the first two tonight. This is not going to happen. I'm disappointed that we're moving off and we're getting stuck in the mud on issues that are going to take a good year for us to get down to. Whereas we could be looking at impact fees. We talked earlier about rezoning East Avenue. That was one on top of our list. Continued review of the code, that some of these changes that could be made. We talked about streamlining approval process, the 2 meetings in the 30 days, eliminating the 30 days and trying to make it easier for businesses to move forward. And I really feel that we should be focusing on some of the low-hanging fruit, and make some of these changes, while at the same time, we can have, we're not going to get through this tonight. We're not going to get through this on 26. Member Nagin is a housing first person. I don't agree with housing first. So there's going to be an impasse. We have some philosophical differences right now that's going on, and I'd like to start focusing on the stuff that we do agree upon. And and moving forward in that way, and possibly hammering it out. We're at the end of terms. We're not going to get this done before November. We're not going to get it done before December. Maybe this is something we start and see what the next council and the next planning board and how this moves forward. I don't believe this is going to get done in the next couple months. I would just as soon address some of these easy fixes that make a huge impact on some of the businesses and some of the people that are moving forward for the city of Lewiston, instead of us spinning our wheels, disagreeing, philosophizing, and coming up with no answer. So I'm disappointed in this process right now. I just think we should be moving forward in a different avenue, in a different way. So I'm not in favor of looking at a map and changing the zoning map, because we have 4 councils right now that do not want to change that zoning map. And we have a majority on it. I just think that we should be focusing on different issues. Thank you.
We're still on item number 2 here. Thank you. Councilor Harriman.
Yeah, thank you. Getting back to the agenda item, which I believe was proposed by the city council to look at. I feel like some of the land that Member Cox mentioned out on Westminster Street is a possible area to expand to. We had mentioned exit 80 as well, which I assume, I mean, that's close to Westminster Street, but could also include areas over near, near the Walmart Distribution Center, Goddard Road. And I realize that there are different philosophies as far as do you locate a shelter, a big shelter that can accommodate everybody in a place that's where it can be located, like a more industrial, less built-up area, and then provide transportation to the services, which are typically in the more downtown areas. I know Portland, their new shelter is similar to that. It's out on Riverside Street. But then there's also the upsides of having the shelters closer to town, where people can provide their own transportation. But I thought this discussion was going to be about discussing the boundaries of that overlay, if there's potential for expanding it to different parts of the city where someone might find a place where they could put a shelter. Because the current overlay is quite limited. I know, I forget which meeting it was. I feel like it was July where we proposed that. Yeah, I just wanted to get everyone else's opinion as well.
Councilor Pease.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We had several workshops on this boundary area and where they could be held. Everybody came to a concession that these are the areas, and we approved those areas. Now, somehow, we get it back on the agenda to change it. I find it hard that we're going to be able to figure that out right off.
I believe Councilor Clement proposed it at one of our meetings.
Mr. Mayor?
We're going to speak when recognized. Thank you.
Sorry.
Councilor Pease, please continue.
Well, that's just my understanding. I thought that's one of our biggest things. We spent, how many workshops did we have on this? How many times did we throw it around? How many times did we change it? And we finally came to a conclusion. This is the best area right now. And in 3 months, we've all of a sudden, now we got to change it again? I don't understand the logic, but thank you.
Councilor Clement, did you have something?
If I might, to Councilor Harriman's comment, Mr. Mayor, he is in error of his recollection. We did have a conversation, and I did say at that time that I would be amenable at some future time to revisiting this if there was a reason to revisit it. I did not say that we were going to have another agenda item, and I'm not in favor of doing this tonight. I think I've made that plain. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Further comments or questions for staff on agenda item number 2? Director Heidegger.
Let's try this.
Can please, Director Heidegger, if you could use the mic, that would just be wonderful. Thank you.
No problem. You'll see in the handout that we gave you, and it's not on your agenda, but we thought it was linked to it, and I'm getting the sense tonight that we might not want to discuss this. But there was also discussion about lodging houses. The council recently adopted amendments to the lodging house licenses, where we have a definition under lodging house, and we talked about how we need to revisit that from a zoning perspective, because now we have non-conforming establishments. And staff's thought was this kind of goes hand in glove with the other discussions we're having: transitional housing, homeless shelters, community living arrangements, all these things that have the council has kind of brought up accessory to the main discussion. I'll look to you folks if you want to have this discussion tonight or not. But again, it's another mapping exercise as to where do we want to allow lodging establishments? How do we want to define them? To Shanna's point, there's a couple ways that we could go about this. We have a large definition right now of lodging that encompasses all kinds of uses. And then from a zoning perspective, that's what this talks about here. You have all these different zoning uses on this side, but you only have a few licensing categories. A suggestion could be similar to what Shanna was saying, is maybe there only is one use group, but you start regulating it by size instead. So you could have a lodging house that's maybe appropriate in a more residential zoning district of a smaller size versus a commercial district where you could have more bedrooms. And maybe that applies to shelters as well. Maybe that applies to community living arrangements or recovery houses, whatever. We regulate it by size. But we were tasked, and it's come up, and that was actually a recommendation from the lodging committee, that the second step to adopting that licensing was to talk about the zoning, and it was suggested that it would be done at a workshop.
Sorry, if I can interrupt you for a second, Director Heidegger. So it's my understanding we finished item number 2, right? Review of shelter overlay district and evaluate if any adjustments are necessary. What agenda item are you referring to?
We are tying it into, staff was making 1 and 2 one item out on this agenda as far as discussion. So you're right, Mr. Mayor. You don't see lodging house on there. You see it on this form here because we felt it was related to the discussions that were being held.
Transitional housing is in quotes. Do you mean that this is also lodging housing as well?
Potentially. I mean, depending on the definition of transitional housing, is that a lodging house? Currently isn't, but somebody may want to make that argument depending if it's not tied to, HUD funding, how that was referenced earlier this evening.
Right. Okay. I guess I'm now starting to understand the direction here. But Member Cox.
I appreciate this because I think this comes up from a business perspective. I think this comes up in some of the other conversations that we've had around rezoning some of the business corridors and commercial corridors and what type of businesses. And I would just say, I can't think of a small residential, single-family home, tight-knit neighborhood that gets upset at the idea of one corner, one building being used as a bed and breakfast, an inn. I'm not talking about Airbnbs specifically, but I'm talking about like an inn. There's some really great examples in our city and across the river. And that I do think that's very different than saying like, oh, great, the Super 6 is going to come in and put in a very lodge. And I do think that the language that we use around rooming a boarding house versus a lodging house it can be really misleading, not just for us, but in the larger guise of our shared conversation conversations, and to Councilor LaChapelle's point, the places in which we've had agreement and can focus on. If we think about this conversation from a business perspective, I think the opportunity to think about it as it relates to scale, some of the changes that we made to be more inclusive of small scale, low impact to neighborhood businesses. As we were going through that shared exercise, this fits really well into there, and it really is about size, right? So like a 4 or 6 room, because I don't think it's about beds when I think about parents and trundles and extra twin beds anyway. But I think it's about, right, like the number of families that can stay, the amount of traffic that it creates, and how the activity of sleeping and eating breakfast fits well into a residential neighborhood where you can have a little bit of business. That it really is about size, because I think pretty quickly if you get to 12, 20, 40 rooms in an inn, it's no longer an inn. I think regardless of how we're defining it in the language we're using, we can pretty much picture the large commercial parking lot, the type of activity, the busyness of it, and that those are very different. And so I appreciate this conversation, whether it's slated for today or a future point. I do really appreciate it. And I think about the way some of the businesses that I work with during my day job really define themselves as hospitality, right? And the lens of which a hospitality-based business is very different than some of the commercial and residential uses that we see for rooming houses and some of the other bubbles, I guess, maybe the best way to say it, that's listed on this sheet. And I think that's a helpful way to think about it, both in terms of scale and use, and for what that's worth.
Director Heidegger, just for clarification purposes, so you have a number of maps here. You intended to talk about the shelter overlay, which we are now, we're not going to be doing that. And then transitional, we are holding off on. And then you're asking if there should be a shelter overlay for lodging houses, correct?
Not necessarily an overlay, but the zones that they're currently permitted in, do we allow them in other zoning districts?
I see. Okay.
Shelley and I were just discussing, I mean, we still have a couple of other things to discuss tonight, and we're almost thinking that maybe we hold off on the mapping side of it for the next workshop. With this meeting being a really good opportunity actually for everyone to at least understand what the terms are here. We have issues with lodging houses, we have issues with transitional, we have issues with homeless shelters, recovery houses. We haven't even really touched upon that, but we have. So I'm thinking this is as much an opportunity, I guess maybe we planted a seed that we need to continue this discussion kind of regardless, because we do need some guidance on staff's side as to if and what we're going to do with these types of uses.
Yes, you're suggesting that we hold off on mapping.
Yeah, I think that's probably in everybody's best interest.
I'm agreeing with your suggestion. Councilor Jelinek?
Thank you. And I would just, concur with Member Cox, Director Heidegger.
Thank you.
How's that? How about that? Because I think that, the scale is a really important consideration for us. I mean, the analogy I'll use is if we're looking at like residential care facilities, level 1, I mean, that's not a big impact to our neighborhood. I have, residents across from me, and they're at level 1, so there's not a whole lot of traffic going on there. You bump that up to a level 2 or a level 3, and you're talking about a whole different impact to a neighborhood. So that's why I think when we discuss whether it's lodging homes, whether we talk about transitional living, to add in that piece to it for us when we come back will be very helpful in later on determining, some of the overlay decisions.
Councilor Clement, did you have something?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, I'll concur with what you just said a minute ago, so that should be really scary. However, I think what we should do is have administration direct staff to come back with a recommendation on changes to anything that needs to be done to lodging houses. I think we work best if we put 15 of us in a room and everyone has an opinion, everyone has an idea. It takes all night and we get nothing done. We could have a common starting point by having staff recommend to us, these are the changes we think. These are the professionals we employ to advise us. Let's use them to do that. Thank you.
I agree some staff recommendations would be in order.
So that's fine. Shelley and I can go nuts on a map, and we can bring it back to you folks. And then, as a group, I'm assuming as another joint meeting is what you're suggesting?
26th.
Okay, that works.
So am I to understand that we are now on item number 3?
Yes.
I'm told yes.
Yes.
I just, I do want to,
Director Hediger, did you have something?
just
Pardon me,
quickly, because you
Administrator
folks
Hunter.
the council has brought this up repeatedly as far as group care facilities and community living arrangements. You folks brought it up tonight. That list is in your packets. We have over 80 of them in the community. The question was asked at a number of meetings, can we regulate them? If it's fewer than 8, the answer is no. Fair housing says you can't do it. I reached out to MMA as well to say, well, okay, great. If we can't do it from a zoning perspective, might we be able to do it from a licensing perspective? They're not too keen on that either. They're not sure that that's a good idea either, given the Federal Housing Act. So I'm not sure that there's much that we can do about that. I asked a similar question from a recovery facility perspective. If these establishments have to happen as a matter of right, there's some suggestion that we treat them like community living arrangements, so that if you're allowing a community living arrangement, which is 8 or fewer, you're allowing a recovery facility, which currently by state law is 6 or fewer. So
People or beds or units?
people, which I guess would be beds. So I just throw that out there because I know that comes up when we've been talking about shelters, we're talking about recovery facilities, we've been talking about transitional housing, and all of a sudden somehow we ended up talking about community living arrangements as well. So we wanted to get that information for you. You have it in there. You can do whatever you want with it. But if that is something that wants to come back to us, let us know. But I think we have limited options as far as the smaller facilities that are going on right now. For better or for worse, because I know I've talked to a number of counselors who have constituent complaints about the activities that happen next to them, and short of either law enforcement getting involved or reaching out to the operators and trying to have them do a better job of managing it, we're rather limited as to what we can do at this time.
I appreciate that clarification. Thank you. Councilor Clement?
It's a question for the director. This would be something that could be handled by our state delegation, perhaps, in the form of state regulation?
Perhaps, yeah,
Since they
because
apparently
right now,
allow it.
yeah, I mean, the whole issue of recovery residences is kind of a hot topic. We've had, full audience here before. We know that the language that you folks actually proposed talked about registered recovery facilities. So I think, as Josh mentioned, there are some facilities that just aren't registered out there. We know even less about those operations. So yeah, it's probably something that maybe the state would look into.
Item number 3.
Food trucks. All right, this one should be quick. It was brought up at a council meeting. I wasn't necessarily at that council meeting, but there were some concerns initially raised with the separation requirements from food trucks and licensed establishments. And how does that apply to our community versus other communities? I've given you the applicable sections of the ordinance, but basically you have to be 100 feet away from an occupied space of a food service establishment having a fixed location. So I can't put my food truck being, a push cart or a food truck, something temporary in nature. I can't put that within 100 feet of a permanent establishment. There was some question about on Lisbon Street whether or not we should reduce that standard. Between our office and the clerk's office, we reached out to a number of municipalities. There's a table in your packet that shows what other communities are doing. We're actually kind of on the more forgiving side as far as setbacks go. So I guess I'm just reporting back to you what we found from other communities, and if there's any desire by the council, because this isn't necessarily a zoning and land use provision, but it's under the business licensing section, if there's any desire for us to revisit this in any respect.
Member Cox?
I would encourage whether it's this conversation or a future one, for us to also look at permitting fees. And this goes into some of the conversation about like ease of doing business and how that's a barrier and incentive. And I offer that because I have had outreach requesting more information about Lewiston's food truck ordinances and specifically their permitting and permitting fees, in part because some of the other municipalities that are within Androscoggin County that I work with have gotten concerns or complaints about their policies being limiting or their prices being a disincentive for mobile food truck businesses and mobile food businesses. And so I think there is some recognition that in some ways, as you offered, we're doing good, which is great. But I do think that if the intent of this ordinance and this language, and we often talk about the purpose, is to incentivize in a particular area or to incentivize a particular use or disincentivize, part of one of the biggest tools that in reality this ordinance is doing is based on fees associated with licensing, use, and location. And so I'd just encourage us to have a holistic conversation from the lens of, you know, image and perception for our city, increased in businesses, income from fees, and that most of the times that I've gotten requests about how this is working in our community and in the other communities that I work in, they do lift up Lewiston's, and a big piece of that is around the fees in conjunction with these rules and what's in that matrix, and I would just encourage us to take a holistic look.
Have we checked in with brick and mortar restaurants? Have we received feedback from them?
Not in a structured way, no. Staff has had some sidebar conversations with respect to some businesses. Some have seemed ambivalent, others have raised concerns, but we haven't done any outreach per se.
Councilor Harriman?
Thank you. I just wanted to note that I brought this up in June because I had a constituent reach out to me. It's kind of a unique situation. He actually owns a restaurant on Lisbon Street and then also owns this food cart. And because of the 100-foot restriction, he's not able to place it in exactly the place where he wants to put it. So I just wanted to bring it up, knowing that we do need to balance the concerns of the brick and mortar restaurants, who typically do have higher costs as well associated with those businesses. So I just wanted to bring it up, and I thought it was interesting that we do seem to be on the more lenient side. I think on the peninsula in Portland is about the only, and Bangor are about the only places, and Brunswick has no limit. So overall, we're more lenient than most places, and but I do think if we were to change this, I think we do need to do a little more structured outreach to existing restaurants and see if they have concerns.
Councilor Scott?
Thank you. I'll just reiterate, that's exactly what I was going to talk about. So when I think about folks coming in from out of town and folks that I've heard visiting the Brunswick area and the accessibility of some of the food trucks and how folks like that. This isn't a draw to our community. I see it as a draw. So I would definitely like to see a continued conversation. We definitely need to include the brick and mortar. We need restaurants to understand. But I'm thinking more along the lines like what we have already been promoting in the city, by the hopeful sign, and we're doing this promotion over there with the food trucks. Can we add more than one over there? Can we expand in that particular area or areas along the river as we start talking about our restoration of the riverfront and doing some of that work there where it's bringing more people in and people are encouraged to want to bring their trucks here because look at what's happening at the Promenade Mall in Portland. Is it Promenade area in Portland where there's it's a fight now for folks to get their food truck there because they're getting so much business and so much action. I would like to see Lewiston having that kind of action with our food trucks, and I think that we could do that. So I am very much encouraged to have a bigger conversation around this. Thank you.
Member Pine?
Do you, just off the cuff from the planning department, do we have some of the concerns? Like, what are the sort of general overall ones? I can imagine, but what are some of the concerns that have come up from these informal discussions?
Similar to some of what the council said, I mean, people are, they have a brick and mortar establishment, they're paying taxes, they're not mobile, they have a lot into it, and all of a sudden you put a similar food truck right in front of my pizza parlor that's serving pizza. That's not fair in their eyes. I think the Eastern Prom is working because there are no food establishments in
Right,
that area.
exactly.
That was part of Portland's goal, was to have that in an area, and it's become its own foodie destination there. You can in Lewiston, assuming you meet the 100-foot setback, you can put food truck on top of food truck down there. That's, the city's been kind of pushing that down by Mill 5 by the Hopeful sign down there. And there are exemptions in this provision when there are special events. So, it's Dempsey Festival or something like that. Bring in all the food trucks, even though you may be next to a food service establishment, you can bring them in. When we've closed down Lisbon Street for festivals before, and we've had food trucks down there. So there is that flexibility that exists. And I think establishments are okay with that because they know there's a lot of people coming to that event then, versus you're just out there on Wednesdays and you're going to put a hot dog stand in front of somebody else who already sells hot dogs. That's not going to be welcomed.
Member Najin.
Just some quick feedback. First, like the Portland model in particular, obviously Portland doesn't have a struggle for any type of restaurant whatsoever, and a lot of people start off in food trucks and then end up with a brick and mortar. That said, like we're talking about all these maps. Wouldn't it be cool if we could come up with a map of where you could put a food truck? Because I think that would be helpful. And when you think about like the prom as an example, you're bringing people to a public space, a park. And right now we have restrictions on both street parking for the food trucks and also having them at parks. And so possibly thinking about ways that we're pulling people into those spaces. And then lastly, there are times in which the downtown businesses are not open. And in those spaces, do you need a 100-foot setback from a closed business on a Monday? It's just something to think about, and ways to continue to bring people into our downtown area in times when the staffing isn't maybe perfect for the restaurants. So those are just some takeaways I wanted to put out there.
So am I coming back with any changes or not?
I would argue that if there's going to be changes to the food truck ordinance, we need to hear in a structured way from brick and mortar. Member Cox?
Sorry, can I ask a clarifying question to everybody, but I guess direct this to Councilor Harriman. I'm not sure what I've heard proposed as changes. I think it's more of a like, should we? And I don't know if that's helpful for us at this point.
It wasn't clear to us what the concern was.
Well, and I mean, I'm hearing some desire to continue to be lenient, to continue to be thoughtful, to think about it as a pro-business opportunity to attract people, which is fantastic. I don't know that we got to any of your constituents' problem. I'm aware of that constituent. I work with him often, and I just wonder if there is an exception, much like Member Najin is talking about, an exception that can be made when it is on the property of an existing brick and mortar with the permission of the existing brick and mortar, then that's okay, right? Like, I just wonder if that's a way in which to consider this, and that might be, for the same example, an existing business on Lisbon Street who is closed Sunday and Monday and says, yeah, if somebody comes downtown and wants to dine and they find that there isn't an option, then that food truck should be there, because then we're retaining people coming to that street to dine. And if that business owner gives that permission, I think that might be appropriate. I'm just looking for that flexibility, because I think the intent behind this is to promote and support businesses while honoring the investments that existing brick and mortar make in our community. And so if we're honoring that intent, I think there's a way to do that allows those, we can survey like crazy, and I think that might even be helpful. But I think if we're recognizing that the input of brick and mortar businesses is fundamental to what we think, I think we should make an exception for a brick and mortar business to allow it on their own property, acknowledging that does impact their neighbors, but that there's got to be some middle ground.
And just to be clear with that, in the downtown, it wouldn't necessarily be on their own property, but it's typically in the right-of-way, it's on the sidewalk or
Yeah.
whatnot.
Member Pine.
Maybe just to make it clearer, could staff come back with proposed language that basically says you must abide by the 100-foot rule unless you have permission from the other food establishments within that 100-foot buffer, whether that's yourself or another business? I don't know if that'll cause any issues, but yeah, if we could just have language that reflects basically that, 100 feet unless you get permission, and then it's fine. And the permission should incorporate the temporal benefits that Member Najin was bringing up as well. So, yes, you can do it, but only when I'm closed.
I understand the reasoning behind that. I guess I'm just concerned with, setting up shop and then somebody's just, I thought it was okay. I talked to so-and-so and then it wasn't. And, those kinds of, it's not cut and dry, and then I think that can be problematic. Councillor Clement?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. If I might question Councillor Harriman, if I understood correctly, this question arose from a brick and mortar establishment that wanted to put a food truck, couldn't set it where he wanted to because it was within the set. I would think that'd be something that could be fairly easily taken care of by allowing, if they own a brick and mortar, to allow them to set up a food truck.
Councillor Harriman, please clarify.
Yeah, the specific ask was, they wanted to put it right next to their restaurant. However, that was still within the 100 feet from another restaurant across the street.
Okay. All right.
So, sort of two different issues. They were asking if we could reduce the setback, and then I don't think they realized that having it right next to their own restaurant would still trigger the ordinance. So it would be reduce the 100 feet down to something else and make it so you could put it next to your own brick and mortar restaurant.
That being the case, Mr. Mayor, I just don't see that we can do anything with that regard. I think we need, if we're going to have a discussion, we need to involve brick and mortar places. I think they have substantial investment in the city. The food truck has basically a licensing fee, and that's it. And I don't think we want to be crowding our brick and mortar out. We've already had some problems this past year where the city was accused of forcing a business out, and if we would grant them all kinds of money and buy a place and set them up in business, they would continue to operate. You may recall that, but I don't think we fell for that, as I recall. But I just think that we have to be deferential to those that are established, paying taxes, and continue to support their business in that regard. Thank you.
Councillor McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think we could get around some of the problems with that is just that they have to have a written permission specifically to what is allowed and not allowed, and have it to be renewed yearly, so that if a new owner takes over and doesn't like it, well, it's there until that 1-year contract runs out, and then it's up to him to decide whether they want to renew it or not. But by having a written statement or written contract, I guess you'd call it, it would alleviate the ambiguities, and it's eliminate, well, he told me, so I'm here. Well, here, where is it? Show it to me. And if they can't show it to them, then skedaddle. I mean, it's very important that we protect the restaurants that we have, those establishments. They usually employ more individuals than the food trucks do. They pay more taxes than the food trucks do. So I think it's important that we respect their ability to make a living. So for that, that's my 2 cents. Thank you.
Chair Bisson?
I was going to say exactly what Mr. Councilor McCarthy said, to have whatever permissions in writing. If you don't have it in writing, get away.
Member Najin?
Just one question on the food truck ordinance right now. The community restaurants or the neighborhood restaurants that are permitted, does that apply to food truck ordinances? So NCB couldn't have a food truck, for instance, which does allow a neighborhood restaurant. The reason why I'm asking this, I'm just thinking, you could put something like a Jeff's Jamaican in a space that wouldn't compete with brick and mortar, in a place where you're looking to actually launch a business before it becomes a brick and mortar. And just as a thought.
I'm not sure I entirely followed what you just said.
Sorry.
No, go ahead, Alex.
I was gonna, so just for clarification here, I didn't read all the way through this. There's a section here that says it's only permitted in certain zones. So it sounds like the action that you're asking for is to amend the language to allow food trucks wherever brick and mortar restaurants are allowed from a zoning perspective. With maybe some additions for, parkland and things like that.
Basically, I'm thinking like, for instance, where Sunnyside Park is, right? If you had a couple of food trucks parked at Geica, at Infab on the weekend, like, that wouldn't hurt any business. And it would maybe build enough support for whatever that restaurant, that food truck is, to eventually have a brick and mortar.
So it sounds like the two proposed language changes that we'd like to be brought back are allow for written permission to be within that 100-foot buffer, for a period of a year or whatever turns out to be best, and then to make sure that there's consistency in the zoning requirements between food trucks and permanent dining establishments, that you can operate a food truck where you can operate a restaurant. Does that capture everything? Okay.
Further comments on food trucks?
Yum, and dinner time.
Director Hudiger, Planner Norton, did you have anything else on this agenda item?
On food trucks, no.
Okay. And now we're at number 4.
We're going to be real quick on this one. Craig is just going to plant a seed for you guys as to what does need to happen this year, regardless if you folks want to do it or not, as far as the legislature has put deadlines to us for January. So go ahead, Craig.
Thank you. I will be brief. So looking at the memo dated September 5th, upcoming ordinance changes required for LD 2003. This is basically a summary of the 3 main parts of the new state law. The implementation date has been moved to January 1st of the next year. So the first 3 parts, the density bonus for new affordable housing developments, where a majority of the total units are designated as affordable. So this has to occur in an area that is a designated growth zone per the 2017 comp plan. If it is, and if it is an affordable housing development, then they can have 2.5 times more dwelling units than would otherwise be permitted. The second bullet, or the second main part, is the allow multiple dwelling units on lots in districts where any form of housing is allowed. So for a lot with no dwelling unit, or that's a vacant lot, if it is located in a designated growth area as per the comp plan, in a vacant lot, it can have up to 4 dwelling units. If it is not located in a designated growth area, then it can have up to 2 dwelling units. This is not automatic by any means. The property owner would still need to adhere to, staff still would have the ability to require additional lot area. So it's not, not automatic by any means. And moving on to the third one, we've already taken care of that. That may seem familiar. Allow accessory dwelling units to be placed on lots with existing single-family homes. This is basically just replacing in-law apartments with some additional utility to them. That's the three main parts.
So just to follow up what Craig summarized for the upcoming changes, what we're anticipating in the coming months that we'll be bringing to you related to this is language that provides for that density bonus for affordable housing developments and kind of what the requirements are that the law has that they would have to meet in order to be eligible for those. So we'll be putting that into the ordinance. And then the second portion that he talked about, which has to do with increasing the amount of dwelling units allowed on individual lots, that will probably be the largest impact to our ordinance. So we will be looking at some zoning districts, for example. Right now, the highway business allows multifamily, but it doesn't allow single-family residences. Our interpretation of how this is written is we will need to allow two-family and one-family in any zoning district where we allow residential, such as multifamily. And then kind of there'll be some reverse with that as well. We have some zoning districts where, you know, we only allow one house on a lot. Now we would have to allow two or potentially up to four. Related to that, he mentioned a couple of times growth areas and our comprehensive plan. When the comprehensive plan was written in 2017, of course, nobody knew that this law would take place and that the word growth would be a key to all of this change. So our map in our comprehensive plan uses the term growth, like restricted growth areas, so areas where the intent really isn't to see a lot of growth, but the term growth was used. So we will probably be bringing some suggestions for some terminology changes to make it more clear what's intended to be a growth zone and what is not intended to be a growth area, so that it can be clearer where these will apply. So those are just a summary of the changes we expect to be bringing to you. So you'll be seeing more of that in the coming weeks and months.
And it's probably another reason to have a joint meeting, for better, for worse, because it's some big changes for a lot of residential areas in the community. So certainly the board, you know, kind of being the keepers of the comp plan and whatnot, you folks are probably more aware of where the growth areas are, but you folks are ultimately going to be the ones adopting it. So I expect we'll be talking to administration about setting up, you know, another joint workshop beyond the 26th.
Councilor McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Now, does whether there's city sewer play into what's allowed on these lots? I thought there was some sort of stipulation on that.
So in communities that don't have a comprehensive plan, so it's an or. So you either have a comprehensive plan, or if you don't, it's areas where there's sewer and water. So in our case, the comprehensive plan and what's designated a growth area is what impacts these increases in density. So we actually will be working on overlaying what our current zoning is with the comprehensive plan map that looks at the growth areas, and there will be a comparison that staff will be doing that we'll be bringing to you about that. At this point, what we've seen is certainly where there's a fairly good overlap with growth areas and sewer and water, although it's not perfect. So it may result in the redrawing of some of the zoning areas if there's a desire to not see areas where there isn't water and sewer designated for this higher density.
Thank you.
Councilor Harriman.
Thank you. I was just going to ask if there was a way just tonight for our benefit, if you could sort of summarize where the designated growth areas are, but it sounds like maybe there's not an easy way to do that, so I'll have to wait for another time.
They've brought the wrong maps. Member Cox.
It's a brief question. We had many conversations about this at the planning board, and some of the conversation that staff had was that current legislative process not only left the timing of implementation a little uncertain, even if it was written, there was a lot of indication that it was going to move, and it has. But the second piece of that was that the content, and there was still a question of if, right? So the dialogue that we were having prior to kind of what I'm hoping is the finality in the state legislature and is creating this action was that there was uncertainty about whether this would be repealed, enacted, and or delayed. And I guess I'm just doing a very clear check that this is being implemented. We don't expect changes. In fact, there are no changes that could happen based on public policy process. And we've got a firm date.
Yes.
Great incentive for all of us.
Yeah.
Just checking.
Yeah, the only sort of wrinkle, and I think it's minor, is that the rules that DECD has put together, they're out for a second comment period, which closed yesterday. So there may be some minor changes and clarifications with the rules, which, as our read as staff, sometimes the rules and how we're interpreting the legislation didn't quite match up. So hopefully a few of those areas will get fixed and we'll get greater clarity. But as far as things that were in the legislature this past year, it would, anything that happened. This is the new implementation date for communities with a council government like we are. And then, who knows what will happen in the next session. There may, again, be efforts to make changes, but at this point, we're working with that January 1st deadline.
Further comments or questions for staff? Anything further, Director Heidegger or Planner Norton?
No, we're going to play with maps next time, so be prepared. No, I appreciate you guys. This was a lot of discussion tonight, so I know it's not always the most engaging, but I think tonight was, and we got some guidance. We'll come back to you folks with some proposals, so maybe there's a little more direction.
You were grinning the whole time. You had a grand time, so thank you, Director, and thank you, Planner Norton. Chair Bisson, the board, and councilors, thank you all very much. Do we need a motion to adjourn?
Well, this is a workshop. You can just close it.
Okay. Yes, I think we are meeting on the 26th.
It looks that way, and my understanding for some members, it's better to start at 6 o'clock. So.
Member Najin, did you have comments?
I just want to bring up that Councilor LaChapelle had a list of things that he wanted to see worked on as well, and so maybe that's something that we could look at. And another piece would be the RIMP plan and the rezoning possibilities for both the riverfront and mill districts in order to move that forward.
Yep.
So I'm just mentioning those other pieces because I think it's important that.
And I don't disagree. Anybody who's been in Shelley's office knows there's a whiteboard up there that has all these basket items on it that we talked about. I guess maybe we started this time last year when we started that. So we haven't forgotten those. We're still picking away at them. But some of these seem to rise to the top given the discussions that have been happening. So we will be back with a lot of those items before you folks.
Councilor LaChapelle.
Again, we can't say it enough that your staff, your office has done a great job. To move in this speed, to get over 1,000 changes made in a year's time has been phenomenal. And thank you to the planning board. Thank you to my fellow councilors. I think we're making a difference in the city of Lewiston. I just want to see that continued growth moving forward and streamlining and making things easier. And the list of things that I said all falls onto that streamlining. I know we talked about East Avenue. That's another one that we should be looking at. And I can go over the couple of the thoughts that I had if you didn't write them down when I was on my rampage. I can review that with you. But thank you. Your staff has done a great job. Thank you to the city administrator and deputy city administrator in moving this narrative forward. So good job to all. Thank you.
Further comments, Councilor Pease? Please use the mic.
Are we sure it's going to be at 6 o'clock and not 5:30?
We are sure it'll be at 6 o'clock.
There you go, Lindsay.
Thank you.
Member.
Just a quick, we, the planning board, have had a number of date changes and or additional dates and or date swaps. And so I'm just looking for either some current guidance or an emailed confirmation of holds and or confirmed dates on Mondays and on Tuesdays through October would be great. Because we'd love to show up on time. That'd be awesome.
I'll just clarify, next planning board, September 25th at 5:30. Sounds like council joint workshop with you at 6 the following night on the 26th. And as far as we know, only one planning board in October on the 23rd. But we'll keep you posted.
Okay.
We'll make sure an email goes out too.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
You all have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If I might, Mr. Mayor,
Councilor Clement?
I think
Yes.
Councilor LaChapelle's comments were well placed. Everybody deserves kudos for what we've done this year. We've had some laborious discussions. We've had some disagreements. But that's how we make change, and I hope we can continue to do that. I think we're off to a good start, and after all, it's all about Lewiston, and let's get it done. Thank you.
You all have a wonderful evening. Thank you for being here.